Danielle Galian of The Wholesaler, and I'm here at the headquarters of CTI today with Dr. Don McNeeley, who is the president and CEO of Chicago Tube and Iron and adjunct professor at Northwestern University's prestigious McCormick School of Engineering, where he teaches the capstone course and the master's and PhD programs. Dr. McNeeley is also a quarterly columnist for The Wholesaler. Dr. McNeeley, I've heard you speak and observed your passion throughout this election cycle. Did the results surprise you?
So first of all, welcome to Chicago Tube and Iron and welcome to your new role. I look forward to working with you and sending messages out to our industry that plays a very vital role in our economy. The election, I guess I should throw my head back and go, not the election again, but the results did surprise me, and I think they surprised everybody. And it's interesting to see people, pundits with revisionist history now, saying that they predicted it. But if you go back, I suggest to you that nobody saw this coming. So those results did indeed surprise me, and by extension, the rest of the country, I think.
You've recently written about how the pundits were wrong. How did you think that happened, or why were so many so wrong?
Yeah, the backstory is we think if somebody said, well, it's about 37%, or somebody comes to you and says 37.24, when people start to work to the right of the decimal, it's creating the illusion of accuracy. All of a sudden that data point, that metric is much more authentic, if you will. But you always have to look at the underlying assumptions. You know, our numbers, 5 rounds up, 4 rounds down. Mathematic principles dictate that, but our numbers truncated. In truncation, we ignore everything to the right of the decimal. So there's an overwhelming math phobia out there. So people, by and large, are prone to being hoodwinked, if you will. But whenever you hear about a poll, you have to look at who's sponsoring the poll. Is it a particular candidate or a particular party? Because there's going to be a bias in it. But then look at the margin of error. So all of a sudden, somebody's making a prediction and the margin of error is plus or minus 4%. That's an 8% range. That's a pretty big swing when you're selecting a president through the Electoral College. So to your point about what went wrong, why were they all wrong? I believe there's an evolution taking place in our country that is occurring slowly over time, but of late picking up in velocity. And there's an old high school science question that says, or adage that says, if you drop a frog into a pot of boiling water, it survives because it knows enough to jump out. But if you put a frog in room temperature water and you turn the flame up, it will die because before it realizes it's at peril, it's too late. So in this situation, we have an interesting political structure. There are 435 congressmen, representatives in the House. And historically, when we structured the nation back in 1776, each state was apportioned a representative based on population. And it was about one representative for every 50,000 in population. And as the country grew, we just started to add zeros. And I mean, if you work the math backwards today, what you're going to see is each state has about one representative for every 500,000 in population. So in 1913, and I'm sorry to lay this foundation, we had a situation where we locked the representatives at 435. So when we look at 319 million people in the country, and you look at a particular state's population, whatever percentage that state represents of national population, that's the percentage of representatives you get. So if a state is 11% of the nation's population, they're going to get 11% of 435 representatives. So let me accelerate this. Each state, to have equal voice, though, we're all apportioned 2 senators. So if you look at that congressional body, if you will, the House and the Senate, there's 535 people. Historically, government was representative government, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. But it really has evolved to a concentration of the purported elite, the elite. The average net worth of a representative, I believe, is about $6 million. The average net worth of a senator is $12 million. That's hardly representative. They're professional politicians. So let me see if I can bring that all back to answering your question. There's an arrogance with that elite, and they feel that they are all-knowing, and they feel that this mass of 319 million Americans are not positioned to think for themselves, so they feel that they need to think for us. And in the last 8 years here, there's been a direct move towards what we call social engineering. So anyway, as that elite becomes more and more concentrated, more and more incestuous, they start to lose touch with the massive. They start to lose touch with the common folk. Add to that the media that is equally arrogant and equally aligned with the elite. I think they've lost touch with the populace. So they had a sense of how they thought things were going to play out, how they thought things would conclude, but they frankly ignored the masses. And the masses in a democracy are still rather important. So I think it was the disconnect.
So politicians and media types that you mentioned, what can they learn from this experience?
Yeah, and as I'm answering this question, I'm realizing you're part of the media, so
Yes.
I don't mean to insult you, so let me publicly apologize. So what can they learn from this? You know, if you look at the world stage, Gaddafi was overthrown in Libya. Why? They ignored the masses. The masses can now mobilize and organize and concentrate and aggregate through social media. And, he met his fate. Mubarak, exiled from Egypt. These are powerful leaders that ignored the desire of the masses. That critical mass is still very important. So what can the politicians learn? First of all, they all walk away with egg on their face. So the credibility is certainly mitigated to a great extent. And I think what they've learned is they have to take data from sources other than the media that is biased, and they have to get in touch with the common folk. They have to get in touch with those of us that are waiting tables and slinging steel and selling pipe welding fitting and driving trucks and driving cabs and teaching school. That's really the pulse of America, not the Beltway.
How do you see the party's strengths and weaknesses?
Wow. Well, the weakness is a much easier answer. The strengths are interesting. There are people there that serve out of desire and serve out of passion. Unfortunately, I think they're in the minority. The Republicans, the Grand Old Party, the GOP, they've kind of lost touch with their foundation. They've kind of lost touch with this populace. They certainly have no connection or no relationship with the millennial generation coming up. In fact, it's worse than benign. It's worse than apathetic. It's actually they've garnered a hatred from the millennials. It's turned them off on the entire governmental process. And the criticism, rightfully so, of the Republicans throughout this election cycle, in which we spent $2 billion. Both parties together spent over $2 billion on this election. The criticism was the Republicans lost touch with the younger generation, and I think that's true. But ironically, those slings and arrows were being thrown not only by the media, but by the Democrats. Isn't it ironic that the Democrats are the ones that got caught red-handed, got caught in the high beams, if you will, because they did not anticipate. So each party, I think, needs to go back and reassess where the future is going, what's the desire of the populace. But isn't it ironic that the criticism of the Republicans by the Democrats is that they had lost touch, accurately so, yet in the end, didn't the election results suggest that the Democrats also lost touch? Yet what did the Democrats just do? They reelected Nancy Pelosi as the Speaker of the House. So I think the result of the election was a great opportunity for both parties to rethink. Staying with the election for a moment, to get your party's nomination today, you need to either be far right or far left. And once you get that nomination, you have to make a beeline to the center, or you'll never get elected. And the uniqueness of Trump's campaign, and he is indeed problematic, the uniqueness of the Trump campaign is he stayed far right all the way through the election and yet prevailed. Now, I hope to see more of this tempering. We've seen a little bit of that of late, because in the end, you do have to be somewhat of a peacemaker on the world stage. So there's a lot for both parties to learn. I think this election punctuated that. I think this election validated that. But the list of corrective action necessary in the next 4 years is significant.
Just to touch on the millennial topic a little bit, because millennials are such a large part of the population, such a large number of the population, how do you think either party or other parties can reach out to the millennials and really grab them and inspire them to be more involved and to take charge of their own future?
See, that's a great point that's inherent in that question, and obviously a very astute question. So, first of all, in a democracy, every vote counts. So there will be pundits out there that say, in order to vote, you should have one of two things, not both, but at least one of two things. You should either have a job or you should own a home. Mm-hmm. Because unless you have one of those two things, you really don't have skin in the game. But the democracy doesn't provide for that. Every vote counts. So whether somebody is a big fat donor writing a big check or picking up the plate at your breakfast restaurant, those votes count equally. And so I think they need to be more receptive to input from people that are becoming more and more unlike themselves, because again, they've insulated themselves with other elites. So I think we need to connect on that basis. The criticism of the millennials is I do my imitation of a millennial. Work-life balance, work-life balance, work-life balance. Mm-hmm. And then, so it sounds like I'm jumping on the baby boomer bandwagon. On the other hand, we baby boomers talk to the millennials about being fiscally conservative. Don't borrow money. Don't put money on your credit cards. Yet aren't we the generation turning over to the millennials $20 trillion in debt? So isn't there a little bit of a disconnect there? And I think the politicians who by and large are boomers, they need to realize the disconnect in what they're saying and what they're doing. What they're suggesting that next generation embrace and what we're handing them in the form of debt. We criticize your generation growing up with all the participation ribbons and the medals you get for doing by and large nothing. On the other hand, as we boomers criticize that, who's given the millennials the medals? We are. They're not giving the medals to themselves. So I think what's happening is the boomers need to recognize that vote counts just as much as your crony. On the other hand, to the millennials, my numbers will be close. Normally they're precise, but they'll be close. There was an anti-Trump rally in Portland 2 weeks ago, and 127 arrests were made. And they did a background check on the 127. 42 of them didn't vote in the election. So I would challenge that generation in saying, on what basis do you have the right to protest? And I embrace the Constitution, and with it the First Amendment right, and by the way, the Second Amendment right, but let's stick with that First Amendment right. I embrace their right to protest, but on what basis do you have the right to protest the result of an election that you yourself didn't vote in? So the boomers need to reach out to the generation needs to position themselves so that they're worthy to be reached out to. So in the end, Danielle, what we do is engineering, re-engineering. We provide for construction projects, but most importantly of all, we create jobs. And the reality is this nation needs good, high-paying jobs. It's a $17 trillion economy. 66% of that is consumer spending. How can consumers spend what they don't have? How can they have without a job? So I think we need to continue to create those jobs. We'll lift the box of job creation. We don't need the government or any of its agencies to help us. But the paradox is they're taking our tax dollars, creating more regulation. In effect, metaphorically, that regulation is people jumping on the box and making it heavier. But in the end, we will prevail. Our industry's been around for a couple of centuries. It's going to be around for centuries to come. I'm pretty confident. Bet on us. We'll be fine. Thank you.